Even though Greek texts are very similar, much more close in their accuracy to one another than even English translations, there are still quite a few differences between Greek texts. So why is that? If the originals were written in Greek, why are they so different today? Well, in this video, we're going to answer that exact question and explain to you some of the reasons and details behind how we got our Greek New Testament. So let's get into it and talk about how this works. The big thing you need to know really is that when the original texts were written, they were written by the original authors, and then copies were made. And copies were made by hand. Some of them were made by the original authors. So for instance, Paul, before he sent off his epistle, for instance, the Ephesians, may have made several copies of it and then sent several copies and then distributed them perhaps at the hand of the courier or whoever carried it when he got to the other end. Sometimes when it got to the other end, people at the other end would take that and then they would copy it. And so those are different ways that copies would often come about. At the end of the 2nd century, we get to this point now where copies have been made of each other, and it might be that somebody who wants a copy of, say, 1 Corinthians for themselves might have 2 or 3 copies of 1 Corinthians, and they're able to copy a copy for themselves from those 2 or 3 copies. So they end up having multiple copies, and then those multiple copies might actually differ from one another, and that might then influence that individual as they copy their own edition. But the fact that as time goes on, there's less and less variation between these copies. Many of the early texts are the ones that make variations for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about that in this video. But as time goes on, copyists become more careful about ensuring they are accurate to copy exactly what was written in the text before them. But that doesn't mean that it's all easy, okay? Nor does it mean that even if they are trying to be accurate, they're actually able to make accurate copies. And we're going to explain all of that in this video. So now that you know the basic reason behind why there are so many copies, let's talk about some of the changes that we see making their way into copies written by New Testament authors. And there are really 2 different types of changes that we see introduced by copyists. The first is unintentional errors or unintentional mistakes that they make while copying. And there's a bunch of different sorts of these. And then the other sort is intentional errors or intentional changes that copyists would make. And again, there's a bunch of these as well. But before I go on, if you're getting value out of this, can I ask you to be intentional and hit that like button? Just give it a good, hard, a good firm tap, just to be intentional about doing that. And once you've done that, if you haven't already done so, hit the subscribe button as well. So let's talk about, first of all, those unintentional changes that some of the copyists would make. And there is a number of different types of unintentional changes that we find in some of those Greek texts. First of all, there are unintentional errors that come up because of poor eyesight. This could be something as simple as a letter that is poorly written, or that maybe the person doing the writing can't see the letter well. Maybe a final sigma, which looks like a capital C in our English alphabet, looks like a capital C, but then you look at that and there's an epsilon, which would look like a capital C with a stroke from the middle of it. And maybe that stroke's not clear, or there's some marking on the parchment, or maybe the author just, the text is faded, whatever it is. There may be a number of different reasons why they can't make that distinction. And so little areas where like that might come up because they just because of eyesight or, visual issues that can't be avoided. Sometimes too, these come up because of faulty hearing. There've got to be a time where copies were made kind of like en masse. So you might go into a monastery and you might see, for instance, one individual standing on a dais or a platform in the middle of the room, and then a bunch of copyists might be standing around them with their own kind of books in front of them that they might be then copying. So the person in the middle would read the text from their copy, and people would hear and they would write down what they heard. Now this leads to some issues because many of the Greek letters were very similar in sound, many of the vowels, for instance. And a classic error that occurs here is found actually in Romans chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, right? And the verb there, ekomen, sounds very similar, whether it's ekomen or ekomen, right? They're very similar in sound. And so one of those is an indicative verb, we have peace with God, and the other one is a subjunctive, let us have peace with God. And so this error creeps in because of, errors of hearing. You're not sure which of those 2 it is, so you write down what you think it is and, hopefully correct it later, or just ignore it and move on. And so errors can come up like that. And it's not just when you have a copyist in the middle, but sometimes even if you're just reading the text out loud, if you're doing a copy, you should try this sometime, you make a copy and you're reading something and you'd read it out loud to yourself and then you'd repeat it out loud as you write it. And even doing that, sometimes you can write the wrong thing because you're not looking letter by letter, you're actually thinking through the words and what they mean. So even using that method, you can also make those errors very easily as well. But it's also errors of the mind. For instance, it could be that you're saying so-and-so came out of the Jordan, for instance. Well, which preposition is that? Is that apo, to come from the Jordan? Is it ek, to come out of the Jordan? Or is it para, to come from the Jordan? You know, and so those kind of synonyms can often be switched out, and that's just a mental error that a copyist could easily make as well. Then there are errors of judgment, and some of these get to be kind of, really interesting. For instance, perhaps one of the worst of these is found in the genealogy of Luke, where a copyist was copying from 2 columns, and on each of the columns it had some of the genealogy from Luke's gospel about how we got to Jesus from Adam, and they end up, rather than reading across and then down through the column, he reads across both columns. Okay, and then he writes that down. And so what ends up happening is that Aram begat God, and then of course Adam is not the source of the human race, but Phares is the source of the human race. And so those kinds of errors can happen as well. That's just an error of judgment on the part of the copyist. So there's all sorts of unintentional errors that make their way into Greek texts, which then later copyists have to think about and figure out, well, what happened here? Why is this wrong? And what should the reading actually be? But there are also intentional changes, and there are a number of these. For instance, in the ancient world, they used to use iotas in a number of Greek words, and sometimes they would drop those out because they were superfluous from a spelling point of view. Sometimes there might be a grammatical issue, such as a chi that would not normally be there, or something like that, which the copyist would then say, well, I'm going to move that or change that because it sounds better to do so. Other times, there were harmonistic changes. So if you look in, say, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 20, it says there, if a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned, right? But then a copyist might be thinking of Exodus chapter 19, verse 13, where that verse is quoting from, and then they might add to that, and one actually did do this, and added the following text from Exodus 19 that's not in the copy that he was copying from Hebrews, which said, or thrust through with a dart. And then, of course, that actually makes its way into the King James and through a bunch of copies down through the ages as well. But it's kind of an intentional change, but it's kind of like taking that idea from the ancient, from the Old Testament, from the quotation, and adding it in. And it may be unintentional, but some of those were also intentional as well. Sometimes there were issues of geographical difficulty, or where maybe the copyist was uncertain that something was accurate, and so they would make a change. For instance, Origen did this when he looked at John 1 verse 28, where it talks about Jesus coming from Bethany, right? He changed it to Bethabara, which is different because he felt that Bethany was problematic, and so he changed the text there. Other times we find that if we have multiple texts in front of us and they're both different, you have to ask the question, well, which of these is right? And sometimes what copyists did is, rather than picking one or the other, they would put them both together in their own copy. For instance, in Acts chapter 20 verse 28, there's a phrase there that says the church of God, and then some copies have got the church of the Lord. And then copyists have had both of those in front of them, and they've said, well, I'm not going to try and choose between these, I'm just going to put them together, conflate them, and you end up with the church of the Lord and God, which is again something completely different. So again, these are the kinds of things. And actually you see conflation quite a bit during the later stages of during the later years, particularly through the Byzantine text tradition as well. So this is not uncommon, but it's also found in older texts like the Alexandrian Vaticanus has also got one or two of these in it as well. And then of course there are doctrinal alterations, some of which come about because of heretics. Heretics were often accused in the early church of making changes to the texts that they would copy for themselves. It's not just heretics that make these changes as well. For instance, some people will take John 7 verse 8, some of the copyists, I am not going up to the feast, right? Jesus is talking about not going up to the feast, but then 2 verses later, after his brothers went up, he also went up. And so some copyists would say, well, that seems to be, how is Jesus saying he's not going up, but then he goes up? And so they would change the ook in that verse, I am not going up, to upo, I am not yet going up. And so then he would go up later on. So there are a variation of changes. Some of those are unintentional and some of them are intentional. But the reality is that you and I later today, we get to see all of these changes, and somebody has to work through, well, which ones are accurate, which ones are not. And for the most part, the church has done this reasonably reliably over the centuries as they've made these copies. They've made notes and margins and all sorts of little things like that that help out as time goes on. So as we look at all these texts, and we have so many texts, literally more than 6, I think, thousand different Greek manuscripts, it helps us to think through all of these changes. Now, all of these changes, though, make their way into groups, and that's what we have now with families of text groups. Now, there are 3 major families that are recognized, and the first of these is the Western text type. And some scholars don't actually believe that the Western text type should be called a text type, and that's a discussion for other people at another time. But this is a series of copies that were made from the western parts of the Roman Empire, Italy, but also found down in the northern part of Africa and Egypt as well. But these are copies that are made quite rapidly. There's not a lot of concern over whether they're accurate or not. These are copies that are used by some of the early fathers, such as Marcion, who's not really considered a father, but Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and a bunch of others as well. They tended to use this text type. And the best copy of this we have today is Codex Bezae, which is D in your apparatus in your Greek New Testament today. So that is an example of a Western text type. The second family of texts that we have is the Alexandrian text, which was a more careful set of texts that were copied more carefully and controlled as well to ensure that copying was accurate. But even here, some of these copies were designed and were modified by copyists to make the Greek a little bit nicer and things like that. These copies were used by people like Origen and Athanasius and Didymus the Blind, and good copies of this that we still have today are copies like Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and from a papyrus point of view, we have P66 and P75 as well. So P66 is a fairly early papyrus, comes from about 200 AD, and it contains the Gospels. So it's a pretty decent papyrus to have, particularly given its age. And then thirdly is the Byzantine text. Sometimes this is referred to as the Syrian or the Antioch text. It comes from more of the Palestinian or Palestine area, Syria, modern day Syria. And this really starts to show itself around the 4th century, the beginning of the 4th century. So it's kind of considered as a later development in the history of textual transmission. This text type was used by Basil the Great and Chrysostom. It is a complete text. It's pretty well rounded out, but it does tend to have a lot of those conflations in it, as I mentioned earlier on, those expanded readings where you combine 2 different readings. But these changes actually added to its popularity over time, and the best example we have for this today is probably Alexandrinus, which we see as, well, at least the gospel element of Alexandrinus, which best represents the 5th century Byzantine kind of text for the Gospels, at least. Most of the copies that we have come out of the Byzantine text tradition, and they are later copies, okay? And most of that is because of the fact that the Byzantine text tradition is really focused around Constantinople, which became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and really was really a center of church activity for a number of centuries leading up to and through the Middle Ages. But most scholars regard the earlier text types, the Western text type and the Alexandrian text type, as earlier and therefore more reliable. And so not many people today hold to the superiority of the Byzantine text type, except outside of the scholarly world. And outside of the scholarly world, there is a huge following of people who really love the Byzantine text tradition and hold it to be superior to the earlier texts, but that's not really a scholarly position, at least not from the point of view of text transmission and criticism today. Anyway, I don't want to get into a big argument about that, because I know some of you watching this will be saying, oh, that's bad, the Byzantine text tradition is the best one, it's the only one that's not corrupt. Yeah, it's not that simple. Anyway, let's just move on, and I'll let you go and look at this. I'm going to recommend a book later on that you can take a look at and get more details on this. The final thing I just want to talk about very, very briefly as I finish up here is how the text tradition and the text that we have age. In the very early days of the church, when they made the first copies of the Greek New Testament, they tended to use papyrus. Papyrus is made from the papyrus reed, which is a plant generally found in Egypt, and it was pressed and dried and pressed and dried and so on into parchment, into scrolls, okay? And this was a very reasonably cost-effective way of copying material down, and found in scrolls, it was easy to transport and so on. The problem with the papyrus, of course, is that it's easily compostable, which means that if you get it wet and it sort of gets stored in its wet condition or in damp conditions, it tends to just deteriorate and be destroyed over time. So they don't last very long, and the papyrus that we have today tend to come from very dry climates like North Africa, in the desert, where there's pretty much no moisture whatsoever. And so they don't last very long, and this means that some of the earliest texts we have, all we have is little fragments of papyrus text because the rest of the text has been destroyed. But starting from before the New Testament period, there was this development where they were able to start to use animal skins. And this really developed until from about the 4th century on, this became the default way of copying texts for the church as a whole. And so from that point, we would use what's called vellum, okay? And that is those animal skins which would be processed and managed, and these would last a lot longer, even though the text would often fade from them as well. And like I said, these became the default for the church, and most of the texts that we have that were hand copied go back to that period where they were writing on vellum, okay? So that's the reason why we don't have that many really old texts, because the parchments that they were written on, the papyrus, easily was destroyed. And the later texts that we have tended to be written on more reliable vellum, which tended to last a lot longer. So because we have lots of different copies and from different times as well, it allows us to see the consistency in the transmission of the text over the years, and there is a huge amount of consistency. And where there is inconsistency, we can pretty much track when that inconsistency came into existence, what century at least, where it came into existence in the world, because we can track these things to different locations and different text types. And then we can kind of track back to say, well, why did that come in? And is that a more accurate reading than this other one over here, and so on. And we can therefore trace a lot of the changes in the Greek text back. Now, this raises a whole nother question about, well, what methodology do you use to track all of this? And that's a subject for another video, and we will look at that subject at some later point. But the point here that I want you to see is that because we have so many copies and we can analyze these and evaluate these like the way I've just been talking about, this gives us a huge amount of confidence in the text of the Greek New Testament, which is really great, because that means that when we get a Greek New Testament, whether it's a Byzantine Greek New Testament or Alexandrinus or Sinaiticus or a Tyndale House Greek New Testament or whatever it happens to be, we can have a high degree of confidence in what's in that text, because we have all these copies and we have all this evidence of the changes that have been taking place over the years. Now, if you're interested in finding out more about this, let me give you 2 things to consider doing. First of all, within Biblical Mastery Academy, we not only teach you how to read the Greek of the New Testament, how to study it in a great deal of depth, we also go through issues like this and teach a course on this. We've got one on 2 Peter coming up later this year, and it's going to give you a bit of an overview of how we actually analyze different texts in a book like 2 Peter, which has got a lot of textual variations in it. So if you're interested in that, consider joining up with Biblical Mastery Academy, or at least go get our free starter pack at bma.to/starter pack and download that, get started, at least have an understanding of what's involved in learning the Greek of the New Testament. Our goal is to give you deeper into the text by going language first. You start with learning the languages, and then you get to know the depths of the scriptures as you go through that. The other thing to do, if you don't want to do that, and not everybody wants to do that, and that's perfectly fine, is to pick up a copy of the text of the New Testament. It's Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration. This is the 4th edition of this. I understand the 3rd edition is like the best one to get, but it's like as rare as hen's teeth. But you can get a copy of this. This is not available on Kindle or any other electronic form as far as I know, but it is available on Amazon, and I'll leave a link in the description below so you can grab a copy down there. Everything I've talked about in this video is in here and far, far more. This is a great book that introduces you to the subject. And again, we're going to read this book in our Reading Academy inside the Biblical Mastery Academy community membership if you're interested in that. And again, the link for that is in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget, if you got value from this video, to hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notify bell, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. We'll see you then.